Tokyo, March 9, 1945, 11:58 p.m. A restless wind blew over the sleeping capital. The air was heavy with smoke from small factory chimneys, and the faint scent of pinewood homes stacked close, together along the narrow wards of eastern Tokyo. From the observation post atop the Ministry of Communications, a lone air warden scanned the sky. The night seemed normal, almost calm. Then the air began to tremble. At first it was mistaken for distant thunder, but the vibration grew deeper, a low, continuous hum that rolled across the rooftops. People stirred in their futons. Dogs barked. Blackout curtains fluttered as the ground quivered ever so slightly. The warden squinted toward the horizon and froze. There, cutting through the darkness, were clusters of blinking white dots. Not fighters, not the small twin-engine raiders they had seen before. These were giants. 4 engines each, moving slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The first flares dropped like glowing rain. Then came the wind. Not from nature, but from fire. Within minutes, Tokyo's night turned to day. The impossible had arrived. The aircraft Japan's top commanders once dismissed as too heavy to cross the ocean now droned calmly over their capital. The B-29 Superfortress had come to Tokyo at midnight. And by the middle of 1943, the Pacific was a map of staggering distances. Between San Francisco and Tokyo stretched more than 5,000 miles of empty ocean. The United States had fought its way across island chains, but Japan's home islands still lay beyond the range of any existing bomber. Even the famed B-17 and B-24 could not reach Tokyo and return. To end the war, America needed an aircraft that could fly higher, farther, and carry more destruction than anything the world had ever seen. That requirement gave birth to the B-29 Superfortress, a technological gamble unlike any before. Conceived under a secret Army Air Forces program in 1939, it would become the most expensive weapon project of the war, second only to the Manhattan Project. Boeing's engineers envisioned an aircraft that could cruise above 30,000 feet, out of reach of most fighters and anti-aircraft guns, while hauling nearly 10 tons of bombs across continents. To achieve it, they created the first pressurized bomber, installed remote-controlled gun turrets, and gave it the new Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, 2,200 horsepower each, pushing the limits of metallurgy and fuel chemistry. On paper, the B-29 was unstoppable. In practice, it was a nightmare. Engines overheated, cowlings warped, cylinders caught fire. Test flights ended in explosions. One crash in Seattle in 1943 killed Boeing's chief test pilot and 8 others. Still, General Henry Hap Arnold refused to cancel it. He believed that without this bomber, the U.S. could not strike the Japanese mainland before 1946. Factories in Kansas, Nebraska, and Washington ran day and night, turning out unfinished aircraft even as engineers were still redesigning their systems. Crews trained on machines that changed weekly. Yet the greater problem was geography. No base in the Pacific was close enough to reach Tokyo. In 1944, Operation Matterhorn was devised, a plan to launch B-29s from India, refuel in China, bomb Japan, and return the same way. It was a logistical absurdity. To send one bomber over Tokyo, dozens of other planes had to fly fuel and bombs over the Himalayas, the hump, into Chinese bases carved from mud. A single B-29 needed nearly 6,000 gallons of gasoline for a mission. Half was spent just carrying its own fuel. Crews faced monsoon storms, mountain winds, and mechanical failures that consumed aircraft faster than Japan's fighters ever could. When the first Matterhorn raids hit the home islands in June 1944, their results were underwhelming. Many bombs missed by miles due to jet stream winds no one had yet charted. Engines failed en route. Some crews bailed out over China. The loss rate was unsustainable. Japanese military analysts studied the wreckage and reports and laughed. To them, the B-29 was a lumbering monster with no practical base of operations. It was, as one officer remarked, an enemy dream with engines that burn themselves to death. For the Japanese high command, the war was still contained. American bombers could torch Hong Kong, Rabaul, or Truk, but the home islands remained out of reach. Geography had protected them for centuries, and Tokyo believed it still would. Factories were scattered among neighborhood workshops. Fuel depots were camouflaged beneath bamboo nets. Even when the first B-29 appeared over Kyushu, many commanders dismissed it as an isolated feat, a token attack with no strategic value. But beneath that confidence, America's industrial momentum was gathering force. Across the Pacific, new airfields were being blasted from coral reefs. Each was a stepping stone toward Japan's heart. The B-29 was still temperamental, but in the hands of engineers and commanders who refused to quit, it was slowly turning from a problem into a promise. That promise would find its home in a cluster of islands whose capture would change the war entirely. The Marianas d nothing in Japan's war would ever be the same again. The real turning point came not in the laboratories of Boeing or the skies over China, but on a small chain of islands called the Marianas. In the summer of 1944, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, three volcanic specks in the Central Pacific that few Americans had ever heard of. To the Japanese, these islands were sacred stepping stones to their homeland. To the Americans, they were the missing link in the range map of the B-29. Once secured, engineers and Seabees worked with breathtaking speed. Coral runways 2 miles long were carved out of the earth in a matter of weeks. Massive fuel tanks rose along the shoreline. Warehouses filled with incendiaries, spare engines, and 100-octane gasoline stretched for miles. On Tinian alone, 4 parallel airfields would soon host more than 500 B-29s. It became the largest single bomber base in the world, a floating continent of concrete and steel aimed squarely at Tokyo. From these islands, the B-29 could at last do what it had been built to do: reach Japan's heart without relying on China's fragile logistics. But success was not immediate. The first raids from the Marianas in November 1944 were high-altitude daylight attacks against industrial targets: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. The crews climbed to 30,000 feet, believing their altitude and precision bomb sights would ensure accuracy. Instead, they found chaos. Above Japan's winter skies, a powerful jet stream, unknown to meteorologists at the time, swept across the islands at nearly 200 miles per hour. Bombs drifted far off target. Entire formations were scattered by the wind. Aiming points vanished in clouds. Engines froze. Turbo superchargers failed. Oil congealed. Bombs meant for Mitsubishi's aircraft works fell into rice paddies and rivers. General Hap Arnold, desperate for results, replaced commanders until he found one who could transform theory into effect: Brigadier General Curtis LeMay. LeMay, only 38 years old, was a master of operational analysis. He studied the bombing photos and weather data and came to a radical conclusion. The B-29's strength was not altitude. It was payload. Japan's cities were built from wood and paper. Their factories were dispersed among homes and alleys. Hitting them precisely from 6 miles up was impossible, but burning them from 2 miles down was simple physics. LeMay proposed something audacious: strip the bombers of most defensive guns and armor to lighten them, fill them with incendiaries, and send them at night, low, over the sleeping capital. Fire, not accuracy, would be the weapon. His staff protested. Flying at 5,000 to 8,000 feet would put them within range of flak and night fighters. But LeMay believed Japanese defenses were too depleted to respond effectively. Radar coverage was thin, fighter fuel scarce, training hours minimal. By early 1945, Tokyo was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Urban planners had warned that any major fire could spread uncontrollably through the tightly packed wooden wards along the Sumida River. Yet evacuation orders were ignored, and the city's civil defense relied on bamboo water buckets and sandbags. Commanders still assumed that high-altitude American raids would remain inaccurate and isolated. LeMay's crews trained for weeks, studying wind charts, altitudes, and routes that would maximize fire spread. The target was not a single factory. It was Tokyo itself, treated as one vast target system. Each bomber would carry 1,700 incendiaries, small canisters of napalm gel that ignited at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The crews were briefed to fly without formation lights, following radar beacons and flame markers, their altimeters set for treetop-level bombing. They took off from Tinian in waves, engines roaring through tropical dusk. Below them, mechanics watched the armada vanish into the night, hundreds of black silhouettes merging into a dark Pacific sky. Japan's commanders, far away in Tokyo, slept soundly. The B-29 had failed before. It was still too heavy, too flawed, too distant. By midnight, they would learn how wrong that assumption was. Technological angle, the superfortress that redefined warfare. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a flying laboratory that turned the sky into a battlefield of data, heat, and endurance. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks, an advantage that no other air force possessed. Its remotely operated gun turrets, guided by analog computers and periscopic sights, could engage fighters from multiple angles without a gunner even seeing the enemy directly. It was the first truly digital bomber of its era, designed to wage industrial war with mechanical precision. Yet, for all its brilliance, the B-29's beating heart, the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, was both its power and its curse. Each engine was a masterpiece of forced induction, but it ran at temperatures that could ignite its own oil. Ground crews called it the engine that burned itself to death. Fire extinguishers were standard. Extra wiring was installed just to dump fuel and save the crew. And yet, when Curtis LeMay ordered the guns removed from the rear turrets to lighten the aircraft, the B-29 transformed again. Freed from its defensive burden, it could carry more incendiaries, more fuel, more destruction. The bomber that once failed at high-altitude precision would become the perfect instrument for low-altitude annihilation. The irony was cruel. The same machine that engineers had designed to be safe, above the clouds, became most deadly when it was forced to fly. Just a few thousand feet above the ground tattoo. Meteorological angle, the wind. That saved Tokyo, then doomed it. Nature itself played a silent role in the bombing of Japan. The discovery of the Pacific jet stream, a high-altitude ribbon of wind that roared at 200 miles per hour, had shocked American meteorologists. It was the first time they truly mapped it, thanks to B-29 weather data. During the early daylight raids, the jet stream shredded bomber formations and flung bombs wildly off course. Tokyo was saved not by flak or fighters, but by invisible air currents. LeMay's answer was simple: go under it. At 5,000 to 9,000 feet, the air was calmer. The temperature, humidity, and wind were predictable. The incendiaries, which relied on dense oxygen and stable air to spread flames, would perform perfectly there. Japanese commanders failed to grasp how decisive that change would be. Fire in low, dry air creates its own weather, a firestorm. Hot air rises, oxygen rushes in from all directions, and the flames feed themselves until entire neighborhoods are swallowed. The night of March 9, 1945, would prove that meteorology could be as deadly as artillery. Intelligence and reconnaissance angle. Mapping the weakness. Every raid began with a photograph. Before Tokyo was ever bombed, American reconnaissance planes, often unarmed B-29s, flew over the home islands, snapping thousands of high-resolution images. Analysts at Guam pored over them, charting which wards made machine parts, which built uniforms, which turned out bullets or gears in cottage workshops. The images revealed a startling truth. Japan's war industry was everywhere. It was not concentrated in giant factories like those of Germany. Instead, small household shops, often attached to homes, made precision components for aircraft and weapons. Destroying one building meant nothing. Burning entire neighborhoods meant collapse. By late February 1945, every ward in Tokyo had been cataloged by production type, building density, and firebreak width. Analysts identified a rectangular zone east of the Imperial Palace, an area dense with wooden homes and small war industries. It was here that LeMay chose to strike. The intelligence had been perfect. The strategy, pitilessly logical. Logistics angle. The machine behind each bomber was an army of unseen workers. On Tinian, every takeoff was an industrial ballet. Fuel trucks, loaders, armorers, navigators, and maintenance crews working in timed cycles. One B-29 required 60 man-hours of service after each mission. Each spark plug, gasket, and bomb fuse had to be checked, packed, and logged. The logistics network that supported the Superfortress was unlike any in history. Freighters carried bombs and spare engines across 5,000 miles of ocean. Seabees built housing for 40,000 men in weeks. Engineers built radar stations that guided the returning aircraft by coded beacons. When the Tokyo raid was planned, 334 B-29s were assigned to launch from the Marianas. Fuel consumption alone for that one night exceeded 1.5 million gallons. Yet every gallon, every bomb, every map was ready, waiting for the signal that would send the world's most advanced aircraft against the most flammable city on Earth. That precision and scale made the U.S. Army Air Forces less an air arm than a mechanical civilization. It was logistics, not bravery, that ensured the raid could happen at all. The stage was now set. Technology, weather, intelligence, and logistics had all aligned. The B-29's failures had become its greatest advantages. But to the men on both sides of the ocean, the coming night would be defined not by numbers, but by survival. Japanese defense angle. Blind to the night by early 1945, Japan's once proud air defense network had become a hollow shell. Radar coverage was fragmented. Only a handful of sets were operational near Tokyo, many built with outdated German schematics. The Imperial Army and Navy operated separate systems, rarely sharing information. Fuel shortages grounded fighter units, and anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed. Japan's best interceptor, the Nakajima Ki-84, Frank, could climb fast. But at night, it was nearly useless without radar guidance. Few pilots had night training, and even fewer had instruments that worked beyond visual range. Searchlights often illuminated clouds instead of bombers, while flak batteries fired blindly into the dark, hoping sound would guide them. To the command staff in Tokyo, the B-29 remained a sunlight bomber. They believed the Americans would never risk low-altitude night raids over the capital, especially stripped of defensive guns. When warnings arrived that a large formation was approaching from the south, the Central Command hesitated, believing it was another diversionary attack. The city's defense plan collapsed before the first bomb even fell. When the incendiaries began to ignite, fire brigades rushed out with hand pumps and buckets. But the flames multiplied faster than any water stream could reach. Firefighters were trapped in alleys of rising heat, their hoses melting in their hands. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned their guns to rescue families from burning shelters. By midnight, command posts were silent, and Tokyo's defense had ceased to exist in any organized form. Leadership angle. The calculus of Fire General Curtis LeMay had no illusions about what he was ordering. At his headquarters on Guam, he studied meteorological charts and urban maps until midnight on March 8th. He calculated wind direction, humidity, and the density of the wards targeted for the upcoming raid. His conclusion was chillingly rational. To achieve the strategic objective, breaking Japan's industrial capacity, he needed to burn the city itself. LeMay's orders were blunt. Each bomber would fly individually, not in formation, to avoid collision and maximize spread. They would enter Tokyo from different compass points and converge in a rectangular fire zone 8 miles wide. The first planes would drop Pathfinder incendiaries to mark the target. Every following wave would drop cluster after cluster of M69 napalm bomblets until the firestorm could sustain itself. The decision marked a fundamental shift in the ethics of bombing. For centuries, war had been fought to destroy armies. Now, war aimed to destroy the systems that fed them. Factories, workers, homes. It was total war, distilled to arithmetic. LeMay understood the human cost but believed delay would cost more lives overall. "If we lose," he later said, "we'll be tried as war criminals. But if we win, history will remember it as strategy." He was right on both counts. Human angle, the sky, the heat and the choice at 12:08 a.m., the first B-29s reached Tokyo. Inside the aircraft, young American crewmen stared down at a black expanse of river and rooftops, faintly illuminated by the city's glow. Their bomb bay doors opened, releasing thousands of small canisters that spun and ignited into fountains of liquid fire. Each burst scattered flaming gel into alleys and rooftops. The first clusters burned bright, marking the path. The next waves turned the city into a rolling sea of embers. From the air, the glow could be seen 150 miles away. For the crews, the heat from the rising inferno shook their planes even at 7,000 feet. Some said it felt like flying through a furnace. One pilot recorded that his skin blistered from radiant heat, despite being inside the cockpit. Others described the smell, a mix of smoke, oil, and something they refused to name. Below, the civilians of Tokyo faced choices no one should ever face. Families ran toward the rivers, seeking air and water. Mothers tied ropes to their children so they wouldn't be lost in the smoke. The firestorm consumed oxygen so quickly that many suffocated before the flames reached them. Amid the chaos, air raid wardens shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of the wind. The flames moved faster than running men. The Sumida River became a boiling mirror, filled with bodies and debris. For some B-29 crews circling above, the sight of that hell made them fall silent. No one spoke until they reached open ocean. The human experience, both in the sky and on the ground, transcended strategy. It was the moment when technology met its consequence. And in that moment, the war's moral balance shifted forever. Shortly before midnight on March 9, 1945, the black runways of Tinian and Saipan came alive. One after another, B-29 Superfortresses roared into the Pacific darkness. Their bellies were packed with M69 incendiary clusters, each a small metal cylinder filled with jellied gasoline and armed with a time delay fuse. When the final bomber lifted off, 334 aircraft were in the air, strung out across 1,500 miles of ocean. At the lead was Captain Bob Morgan's Pathfinder group. They flew low over churning waves, throttled back to conserve fuel. Inside the pressurized fuselage, the temperature hovered above 90 degrees. The men stripped to undershirts, sweat glistening in red light. Radar screens pulsed faintly. Ahead lay the outline of Honshu, barely visible beneath scattered clouds and moon haze. At 12:08 a.m., Morgan's bombardier toggled the first switch. The bomb bay doors groaned open, and dozens of canisters tumbled into the dark. 30 seconds later, the sky above Tokyo erupted in orange specks. The city's east side, densely built wards of Shitamachi, had been marked. Every minute that followed multiplied the fire. By 12:30 a.m., waves of B-29s approached from multiple directions. Each aircraft released its load within seconds, spreading lines of burning gel that clung to wood, paper, and skin alike. The incendiaries penetrated attics and tatami mats, igniting 1,000 small fires that merged into rivers of flame. The carefully plotted geometry of LeMay's plan unfolded. The first wave created a fiery X across the eastern wards, guiding subsequent squadrons toward the glowing center. The wind, moving at 15 knots from the southwest, carried the flames deeper into the city. Streets designed as fire breaks became chimneys of hot air. From the air, crews saw the pattern clearly. Square miles of orange, merging, pulsing. Pilots adjusted their headings by the light of the burning city. The inferno below generated updrafts so strong that bombers rocked violently, instruments flickering from turbulence. On the ground, Tokyo dissolved into chaos. The first alarm sounded too late. People burst from shelters carrying futons to block falling embers. Within minutes, the heat became unbearable. Asphalt bubbled. Water boiled in cisterns. Those who fled toward the Sumida River found the bridges jammed with carts and bicycles. When the wooden spans ignited, the crowds plunged into the black water. Inside Japan's Air Defense Command, telephones rang unanswered. The fire had severed cables. Observation posts reported that the bombers were too low for radar, too many to count. Searchlights stabbed upward, but smoke obscured everything. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly until ammunition ran out. Night fighters launched from Yokota, and Atsugi never found the enemy. Most turned back for lack of fuel. By 1:30 a.m., Tokyo's eastern districts were a single living firestorm. Flames rose more than 1,000 feet into the air, drawing winds approaching hurricane strength. Oxygen vanished. The pressure difference created its own vortex, pulling roofs from houses and people from shelters. Wooden water buckets caught fire in men's hands. Whole blocks collapsed into molten rubble. Some B-29s were damaged by the very inferno they created. One crew reported that the heat warped their wings and set paint bubbling on the fuselage. Another bomber stalled as the updraft hurled it skyward. Yet losses were minimal. Only a few aircraft were downed, far fewer than expected. At 2:30 a.m., the final waves crossed Tokyo, dropping incendiaries on the already burning heart of the city. The glow reached 200 miles out to sea. Crews returning to Tinian could still see the reflection of the fire in their cockpit windows 3 hours later. When dawn arrived on March 10th, the scale of destruction defied imagination. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been erased. Entire neighborhoods no longer existed on the map. The area around the Sumida River, once a maze of homes, factories, and schools, was an unbroken field of ash. The B-29 had done what no weapon before it could: transform a capital city into data points on a mission chart. Tokyo had become a target system, and its annihilation had taken less than 3 hours. The raid marked a new chapter in warfare, one measured not in victories or defeats, but in tonnage, temperature, and square miles burned. Yet even amid success, LeMay's staff realized they had crossed a threshold from which there was no moral return. At sunrise on March 10, 1945, smoke still coiled over Tokyo like a second atmosphere. The city was gone. Where wooden wards once stretched for miles, there remained only black ash, twisted iron, and the outlines of rail tracks and canals. Even the Sumida River steamed from the heat. From the air, reconnaissance crews stared in silence. Cameras clicked automatically, capturing a landscape that looked more lunar than urban. On the ground, the numbers began to form: 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless, 16 square miles destroyed. More people had died in a single night than at Hiroshima or Nagasaki later that year. LeMay's staff gathered data as precisely as they had planned the raid. Bomb loads dropped, fire spread speed, total fuel used, losses sustained, all calculated within hours. Only 14 bombers were lost. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the statistics represented maximum effect at minimum cost. For the survivors in Tokyo, it was the end of the world. Eyewitnesses described the silence that followed. The wind had died. Bodies lay where the heat had left them, often reduced to white outlines on the ground. Firefighters who had survived by diving into cisterns emerged to find their stations gone, their comrades burned alive. Families searched the ruins by the glow of embers that would smolder for 2 days. Across the Pacific on Guam, General Curtis LeMay read the first reports without emotion. He had ordered the mission based on logic, and logic had delivered. The impossible bomber had achieved what no fleet, army, or blockade could: the direct crippling of Japan's industrial core in a single strike. But the data revealed more than victory. It revealed a method. The birth of fire strategy over the next 72 hours, LeMay ordered follow-up raids on Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Each followed the same formula: night approach, low altitude, incendiary saturation. The results were devastatingly consistent. Every major industrial city built primarily from wood became a furnace. In less than 3 weeks, Japan's urban network of small factories and home workshops had been largely destroyed. Intelligence officers confirmed what analysts in Washington had theorized. Nearly half of Japan's war production came from civilian districts. The destruction of homes was the destruction of factories. The line between civilian and military target had effectively disappeared. Reports from captured Japanese documents later revealed the shock at the highest levels. General Hideki Tojo's successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, had previously mocked the B-29 as a machine that cannot reach Nippon. Now, Tokyo's inner ministries described the March 9-10 raid as a disaster beyond imagination. One internal communication read, "There is no defense against such force. The very air becomes the enemy." Within days, Japan began digging new fire breaks and dispersing industry even farther. But it was too late. The next month, over 60 other cities would burn. The psychological shock Tokyo's population reeled. The raid shattered faith in the Imperial Army's ability to protect the homeland. Newspapers printed only partial casualty lists, but word spread through the ruins. Refugees flooded into rural prefectures, carrying stories of molten rivers and sky-wide flames. The morale that had sustained years of war cracked overnight. For the Americans, the psychological reaction was different. B-29 crews returned to Tinian greeted as heroes. Some were jubilant, others subdued. Photographs from the next morning show men eating breakfast beside piles of incendiary casings, staring blankly into their coffee cups. One wrote in his diary, "We did what we were told, but I can still see the city moving. Not burning, moving." The mission's success redefined the purpose of the Superfortress. No longer was it a high-altitude precision weapon. It was now the ultimate tool of area destruction. The term precision bombing faded from operations manuals, replaced by urban target systems. A war-transformed Washington took notice immediately. General Arnold wired LeMay, "This proves the correctness of your new tactics. Continue." Within a week, production lines back home were retooled to maximize incendiary output. Napalm became as vital as ammunition. Japan's military planners faced a new nightmare. The B-29s could now strike every city on Honshu, every night, without resistance. Radar coverage couldn't stop them, and fighter squadrons lacked the fuel to intercept. The Empire's vast distances had become meaningless. What had begun as a single experiment over Tokyo had evolved into a doctrine, one that combined engineering, logistics, and ruthlessness into a single continuous mechanism. The laughter that once greeted talk of the B-29 was gone. In its place was fear, quiet, total, and justified. By the end of March, Japan's urban heart had been turned into charcoal. The world's first strategic fire campaign had succeeded far beyond its architect's imagination, but behind the calculations lay a question that could no longer be ignored. If victory required turning cities into furnaces, what would peace look like? When the smoke over Tokyo finally drifted out to sea, the war in the Pacific entered a new phase, one not of battlefronts and fortresses, but of fire and fear. The March raid had proven that geography no longer protected Japan. For centuries, the island nation had believed its distance was a shield. But in one night, that illusion vanished. At General Headquarters on Guam, Curtis LeMay's staff analyzed every metric of the Tokyo mission. The results spoke a single truth. Low-altitude incendiary raids were more destructive, more efficient, and far cheaper in lives and fuel than the high-altitude daylight attacks they had tried for months. Tokyo's annihilation had cost only a handful of aircraft, a statistical miracle compared to European bombing campaigns. LeMay wasted no time turning success into a system. Within days, he reorganized his X-Dietchen Bomber Command into a relentless engine of destruction. Crews were rotated on accelerated schedules. Maintenance bays worked around the clock. Targets were assigned in clusters: Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and later Yokohama, each chosen for its building density and production output. The goal was not a city's symbolic value, but its industrial yield per square mile. This was industrial warfare in its purest form. Each bomb tonnage was measured against economic loss. Analysts on Guam calculated burn ratios, how much material destroyed per ton of incendiary dropped. Factories and homes were treated as interchangeable inputs. In LeMay's operations room, walls filled with maps color-coded by destruction percentages. It was warfare turned into accounting. Across the Pacific, the Japanese government tried to make sense of the disaster. Emperor Hirohito received the first accurate report 3 days later. Entire wards erased, more than 1 million people displaced. The Home Ministry admitted that no plan existed for a catastrophe of that scale. Civil defense measures, bucket brigades, bamboo brooms, sand pits, had proven worthless. The psychological blow rippled through the armed forces. Soldiers returning from the Philippines found their families gone. Pilots at training fields near Tokyo saw the red glow still flickering on the horizon at night. The Imperial Army, stretched thin in China and Burma, could offer no protection to the homeland. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, watched the new campaign unfold with awe. For years, naval planners had assumed that invading Japan would require amphibious landings on the home islands, with an expected 1 million Allied casualties. But if the B-29s could destroy Japan's ability to fight from the air, to feed, arm, and clothe its troops, then invasion might never be necessary. By April 1945, the firebombing strategy had spread to 60 cities. Entire industrial belts were systematically erased. Transportation grids collapsed under the weight of destruction. Bridges melted, rail lines twisted, water systems boiled dry. As the airfields on Okinawa came online, the superfortresses gained even more reach, allowing missions deeper into northern Honshu. What had begun as one experimental night over Tokyo became a campaign of extinction against Japan's industrial civilization. In Washington, officials debated the morality quietly but accepted the arithmetic publicly. The Joint Chiefs declared the bombing strategically decisive. Reports showed that Japan's war production fell by over 50% within 3 months. Shipyards stopped building. Aircraft assembly plants lost power. Food distribution broke down. The scale of success exceeded prediction. Japan's economy, already brittle from blockade, disintegrated. Every night the superfortresses came, invisible until the incendiaries fell. Japan's civil defense slogans, once proud, "One bucket, one bomb," became grim jokes whispered among survivors. By June, more than half of Japan's major cities had burned. Tokyo's ruin was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a model replicated again and again. Yet behind every mission report, the human toll grew unspeakable. The casualty lists became statistics. The photographs, monochrome evidence of a doctrine perfected. The United States had found a way to wage war with math, and it worked. But that efficiency raised a haunting question among even its architects. If such destruction could be achieved with gasoline and steel, what would happen when a single bomb could do the same? That question would soon be answered. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation living under a sky that never slept. Every night, the low hum of 4 engines meant another city was about to vanish. The superfortress squadrons had refined their rhythm into something almost mechanical. Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, Sendai, Toyama. Each was attacked in rotation, mapped, burned, and recorded. In July, American intelligence reported that more than 60% of Japan's urban area had been destroyed. Nearly 9 million people were homeless. The once proud industrial empire that had fueled Japan's expansion in the 1930s now lay in ruins. Electricity grids were fractured. Transportation between major cities barely functioned. Coal and oil production fell to less than 1/3 of their wartime levels. Factories that survived lacked labor. Food shortages led to malnutrition among workers. The blackout drills and patriotic songs of earlier years gave way to quiet despair. The government banned public mention of fire death, but the smell of ash lingered everywhere. For the United States, the B-29 campaign became the central axis of strategy. The island-hopping offensives that had consumed thousands of lives were now seen as preludes to this, the destruction of Japan's war potential without invasion. When Okinawa fell in June, new airfields placed Japan's northern regions within reach. From there, the B-29s launched raids day and night, some carrying high-explosive blockbusters, others laying mines in harbors to choke shipping lanes. Yet, even as success grew, so did uncertainty. President Truman's new administration faced a question of scale. How much destruction would be enough? Japan's leaders refused to surrender, even as their cities disappeared. American intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting that the army still believed it could repel an invasion. A final, suicidal defense of the home islands. By July 1945, the B-29 had reached its ultimate form. Some aircraft were modified to carry weapons beyond imagination, single bombs capable of annihilating entire cities. The crews of the 509th Composite Group trained in secrecy on Tinian, the same island that had launched the Tokyo fire raids months before. The Superfortress name now carried a literal meaning. The legacy of those nights over Tokyo cast a long shadow. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, their devastation was new in technology, but familiar in logic. Both cities burned in the same pattern of firestorms, their destruction measured in the same statistical language born in the March raids. In a grim sense, Tokyo had been the rehearsal for the nuclear age. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the nation's leadership cited a new and most cruel bomb. But the truth was deeper. Japan was already a country without cities, without fuel, without options. The B-29 had ended the war before the atom confirmed it. The ledger of fire. The numbers that historians would later assemble tell the story with chilling precision. 67 Japanese cities burned. Over 500,000 civilians killed. 8 million homes destroyed. 16 million people displaced. The B-29 flew 31,000 sorties over Japan and dropped more than 170,000 tons of bombs. Only 414 aircraft were lost to all causes combined. A survival rate unimaginable in Europe or earlier Pacific operations. In the end, the weapon Japan once dismissed as a mechanical fantasy had rewritten the laws of modern warfare. The Superfortress had achieved what no navy or army could. Victory through air alone. Yet beneath the triumph lay an uneasy silence. The understanding that war had crossed into a new dimension, one where destruction was calculated by efficiency, not courage. Tokyo was the moment the world learned that civilization itself could become combustible. The raid on Tokyo was more than a battle. It was a turning point in how humanity understood power. For centuries, war had been measured in armies and fleets, in ground gained or lost. But on that March night in 1945, the battlefield expanded into the sky, and destruction became a matter of engineering. The B-29 Superfortress was not simply a bomber. It was a philosophy of war made metal. That distance, altitude, and precision could replace attrition. It proved that technology could erase geography. Japan's oceans no longer mattered. Its cities no longer hid behind mountains or coastlines. The same machine that crossed the Pacific to burn Tokyo also crossed an invisible line in human morality. It showed how data, logistics, and science could be turned into a language of annihilation. For the Americans who built it, the B-29 was the triumph of industrial genius. A weapon so advanced, it shortened the war. For the Japanese who endured its fire, it was the end of a world they had known for centuries. Between those two truths lies the essence of modern warfare. Progress and devastation, intertwined. After 1945, the Superfortress would carry new bombs. Singular ones, capable of burning entire cities in seconds instead of hours. The glow that once rose from Tokyo became the silhouette of a new age. An age when every nation would live under the shadow of what the B-29 had proven possible. Today, the ruins of that night are gone, replaced by towers of glass and steel. Yet the air above Tokyo still holds the memory of that. The sound of engines that changed the world forever. The Japanese commanders who once laughed at the idea of the B-29 never imagined that one day it would hover over their capital, turning midnight into day. And in that moment, the war they thought they understood ended. And a new kind of war, the modern one, began. If you're still here, you're one of us. someone who loves real history told with honesty and depth. Tap, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this documentary with a friend who needs to know what really happened over Tokyo that night.